After the Great Western Campaign of Batu and Subutai, Western Asia up to the borders of Hungary was under the rule of the Mongol World Empire. This branch of the dynasty was descendant of Chinggis Khan's eldest son, Jochi. After the 1260s, we know their state as the Khanate of the Golden Horde. Today, we'll explain what it was like to be a prince in the Jochid Ulus in the mid-13th century by looking through the early life of one of its most well-known members, Nogai, the topic of our ongoing series. Though later on in life Nogai became a very powerful member of the Golden Horde, and I argue has erroneously been depicted as an almighty kingmaker, very little of his early life is known from the historical sources. Therefore, along the way we'll address some myths around Nogai's early life that have no basis in history. Nogai was a great-grandson of Jochi through a rather minor son. Alexander Uzelac suggested Nogai was born around 1237. This is never specified in the primary sources, but seems probable on a few things, given his generation and the fact that 1237 was, in the Inner Asian cyclical animal calendar, the year of the dog, which is the meaning of Nogai in Mongolian. Names in Mongolian, as in most languages, were chosen carefully. Either an inhuman thing, which was intended to confuse evil spirits which might bring harm to the child, or so named because this was the first thing the mother had seen after giving birth. Or the child was named after auspicious things to bring good fortune or strength. We do not know where Nogai was born, or the whereabouts of his father, H.A.R, in this period. Possibly H.A.R accompanied many other members of the Jochids on Batu and Subutai's campaign, though it cannot be excluded that he was with another Mongol army elsewhere in Asia, or the original Jochid territory along the Irtysh River, or in Mongolia itself. As wives, especially of princes, sometimes accompanied men on campaigns, staying in the main camp or ordu to prepare and look over equipment and animals in the absence of the husbands. It is possible that Nogai was born in any of these regions. If Nogai's parents accompanied Batu and Subutai, and he was born in 1237, then he may have been born shortly before the Mongol attack on Ryazan, the first of the Rus cities to fall. The identity of Nogai's mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother are unrecorded, though it's often claimed that any of these women were concubines, and that Nogai or his father were illegitimate and hence excluded from ever becoming the Jochid Khan. These details are not present in the sources. Nogai's family could not take the Jochid throne simply because that was restricted to Batu and his descendants. With the exception of his brother Berka, the line of Batu headed the Jochid lineage from about 1227 until 1360. Further, the Mongols generally did not restrict succession or inheritance on the basis of the mother's status. Military backing, charisma, and descent from a designated male branch of the lineage mattered a great deal more than a mother's identity, particularly as even the identity of Berka's mother is unknown. Nogai grew up similarly to all other Mongol boys of the imperial era, with the expectation that he dedicate his life to expanding the Chinggisid Ulus. All Mongol men from about 14 to 70 were to fight if called upon, including princes. Thus, much of Nogai's early life was spent learning the skills of war. Before he could walk, he was tied to a saddle on the back of a sheep. By the time he was 3, it was to a pony, in order to early on build the endurance and balance to spend a lifetime on horseback. As a boy, he was given a small bow to hunt rodents and birds, building the muscles and hunter's eye needed of a Mongol archer. Before long, he accompanied his father, uncles, and cousins on hunting trips, including the Nerga. The Nerga was a vast horseback operation where they encircled off a designated area, driving together all the game as the circle tightened. No animal was allowed to escape. To ensure this, Nogai and the other boys learned coordinating and moving units over vast distances, following orders and meeting timetables, the key parts of the Mongol success in the field. In the mid-13th century, all Mongol princes still lived as nomads, moving the camps and herds of sheep, goats, cattle, horses, and camels between winter and summer pastures. The moving of these large herds, thousands of animals, required careful planning and cooperation to ensure proper water and pasture resources along the route. Keep away from those areas designated for winter, while maintaining the animal's weight and health. This also provided excellent training for the logistical needs of supporting and moving large armies on campaign. Importantly, these movements had to avoid pastures that did not belong to them. Pastoral nomadism in the Great Eurasian Steppe was not aimless wandering over empty, endless grassland, but carefully managed movement in allotted territories. The Mongol Empire was seen as the shared property of the Chinggisids. If you were a descendant of Chinggis Khan, by right, you were allotted patrimony to support yourself, your family, and descendants. The entire imperial population fell into these lands, either the property of the Great Khan or the princes. The Golden Horde was not an empire of nomadic bands going wherever they pleased. The entire area was divided into major wings, which were made up of uluses, patrimonies, subject peoples who were assigned to princes and members of the military elite. Each of these units, be they Tumen or Minghan, were assigned a specific area to provide for themselves and raise their herds and live when not on campaign. Leadership of these positions were hereditary, though the Khan, be he in Karakoram or Sarai, maintained his right to move and remove these leaders. This is a topic explained more fully in my previous video on the tribes of Mongolia, so give that a watch if you want to learn more on this concept. In short, nomadic inter-Asian tribes, as popularly imagined, don't exist. Instead, nomadic societies were made up of the hereditary military divisional units. For the Mongols, these were the Minghans, into which most subject peoples were divided. The name of the tribe would in fact be the name of the ruling lineage. Nogai's family would have been a part of this system. Assuming they headed at least a Minghan, the primary organizational unit, they would have been involved in managing it essentially like a fiefdom, controlling access to the natural resources of their ulus, such as pastures, fishing lakes, or salt-producing areas which were designated for members of their Minghan, or they would charge people outside of their Minghan for the use of these resources. The salt springs of Crimea, for example, made Batu and his son Sartok considerable revenues in this manner. The Minghan leaders acted as local administrators on behalf of the Khan, settling local disputes and enforcing the Khan's laws, while the Minghans themselves were the basis for taxation, all in addition to their obvious military role. In scholarship, you will see two areas suggested for the location of Nogai's family ulus: north of the Caspian Sea, or between the Dnieper and the Don rivers. I do not believe there is support in the sources for either suggestion. The association of Nogai's family controlling the North Caspian Steppe rests on the fact that this was the core of the later Nogai Horde, a Golden Horde successor state that emerged in the 15th century. And what connection does the Nogai Horde have with the 13th century Nogai? Absolutely nothing beyond the name. The connection is only made by modern writers. The Nogai Horde traced its founding to the 15th century Golden Horde khanmaker Edigu, a man with no relation to Nogai. The connection of Nogai to the Dnieper lands is likewise tenuous. Nogai's grandfather Baal appears in the Mamluk sources as Mual. This appears kind of similar to a name John de Plano Carpini recorded in 1245 for a Mongol commander along the Dnieper's east bank, Mochi. Mochi is otherwise unidentified and may not even be a Chinggisid. The Mochi of Carpini's account may simply have been a general briefly assigned to the area in the aftermath of the 1242 withdrawal from Hungary. By the 1250s account of William of Rubruck, Mochi is nowhere to be seen, replaced by other commanders and Batu's son Sartok. Khans like Batu held proudly their prerogative to replace and move around the princes and generals or their uluses. When Batu was annoyed at Berka's contacts with Muslim merchants coming up through the Caucasus and giving gifts to Berka instead of him, Batu ordered Berka moved to the area northwest of the Caspian, closer to the Khan's own ulus, where he could keep a closer eye on him. The routine of life was defined by the season. From January through August, the Jochits moved their herds north to cooler pastures to avoid the summer heat. Come winter, they moved southwards to milder steppes. For the princes, their movements were likened by William of Rubruck, an eyewitness from 1253, to the movement of cities on wagons. The gers of princes were permanently set up on the backs of carts so huge he described their axles like the masts of a ship. The prince and his wives each had their own such cart, pulled by dozens of oxen and followed by perhaps hundreds of smaller carts bearing possessions and supplies. It was the responsibility of the wives to organize the loading and driving of these caravans. Each member of the Jochid elite now had dozens or hundreds of servants and slaves, and the women retained much of their traditional duties for running the home and its movements. As such, the Mongol princes generally did little but prepare for war, making and maintaining bows, saddles, and other equipment, or hunting to keep their skills sharp. In the height of the summer, the princes took part in their favorite pastime, drinking copious amounts of alcohol. For that was when the animals, especially the mares, began lactating, and the Mongols could then enjoy that classic beverage of the steppes, fermented mare's milk, erig in Mongolian and kumis in Turkish. The more potent, distilled version was karakumis, which was the treat of the Mongol elite. The alcoholism of the Mongols is thoroughly attested. Batu kept some 3,000 mares near his camp solely for the purpose of producing him daily quantities of karakumis. This does not include the herds dedicated to producing for him regular erig. Rubruck describes the Mongol men and women doing almost nothing in these summer months but drinking erig, the men taking breaks only to hunt or pass out. Their incredible alcohol intake likely accounts for the obesity and gout the Mongol elite tended to suffer from. Batu's gout was severe enough that he could use it as an excuse to avoid returning to Mongolia. This is likely a contribution to the low fertility and early deaths of many Khans in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. After the 1280s, shockingly few Khans lived past 35. Food production for the princes was largely done by the families in the Ming Hans, who managed most of their herds. Like peasants working a lord's land, poorer Mongol herders managed the aristocrats' herds. Additionally, each Jochid prince procured foodstuffs from the non-nomadic peoples in their ulus, such as villages in the southern steppes whose purpose was to send grain to their Mongol masters. Production for the Mongols' usage was the job of entire communities. Even in the 1250s, Rubruck saw the Mongol princes commonly dressed in precious cloth of silk, cotton, or gold from China or Iran, or the finest of furs collected from the Rus, Bashkirs, and other subject peoples of the north. Many princes spent part of the year in the Ordu of the Jochid Han. The number would grow over the following decades, especially during the reign of Özbey Han, when many of the nobles had manors built in the suburbs of Özbey's new capital of Sarai al-Jadid. Rubruck saw some 500 of these princes and elite always in Batu's company. As Nogai, when he first appears in 1262, was already a close comrade to Berke, we might assume he was such a prince who spent much time in Berke's Ordu, perhaps even before he became Khan. In the case of Berke, the princes of his Ordu are reported to have joined him as early converts to Islam. Berke was either raised a Muslim or had sincere interest in the religion since his youth. Likely in 1252, while returning from the coronation of Möngke Khan, he stopped in Bukhara, where, after spending some time with the Sufi sheikh Saif al-Din Bakarzi, he made official announcement of his conversion. It's reported that, while Islam was yet to spread amongst the larger population of the Jochid Ulus, that Berke succeeded in getting his wives, some generals, and relations, including perhaps two of his brothers, to join him in Islam. His great-nephew Nogai may have been among them. Nogai's own conversion to Islam is not mentioned until about 1271, but it seems likely that given his close association to Berke's family and circle, that Nogai converted, if not alongside Berke, then soon afterwards. Perhaps he even accompanied Berke to Bukhara in 1252 and joined him in receiving lessons from Sheikh Bakarzi. Perhaps after this, Nogai was a constant presence at Berke's Ordu, becoming a close comrade. It would explain why, when Nogai first appears in 1262, perhaps only 25 years old, he was already trusted as Berke's commander-in-chief, leading armies against Hulagu. Was 1262 Nogai's first military operation? It's unclear, but I doubt Berke put a man with no military experience up against other Mongols. The 15th century Polish chronicler Jan Długosz puts Nogai in the 1259 attack on Poland. However, the description appears to be largely conflated with Nogai's 1288 Polish attack. It is not impossible that Nogai took part in the earlier campaign, though not in a command role. He may well have been among Jochid troops provided for campaigns across the empire. His own first cousin of similar age, H.A.R, was among the ill-fated Jochid princes given a tumen to join Hulagu's attack on Baghdad. Most likely, his first taste of battle was against local groups in, say, the Caucasus or Circassia, who still resisted Mongol power. Again, no surviving source contains these details. It's doubtful Nogai was born before 1230, so we can assume he was much too young to take part in Batu's western campaign. What language might Nogai and Berke have spoken to each other? The percentage of the Jochids from Mongolia was always very small. A minority within a mostly Turkic-speaking population. By the 1260s, an entire generation had grown since Batu's western campaign who had never even seen Mongolia themselves, living only in the Dashti Kipchak and interacting predominantly with Kipchak speakers. Even in 1253, William of Rubruck saw the Cuman language as identical to Tatar, and the parts of the Codex Cumanicus compiled at the end of the 13th century likewise tend to refer to Kipchak as the Tatar language. We therefore may assume that Kipchak Turkic was the language of everyday interaction in the Jochid Ulus. For the Jochids, so few documents survive from their early history that it's difficult to detail the usage of Mongolian among them. Likely Mongolian was, from the inception of the Jochid state, restricted to the aristocracy and parts of the army and administration. Mongolia-born men like Berka were certainly bilingual. Nogai's generation, as he still grew up in the age of the United Empire, may have been the last to speak Mongolian as a first or even second language. After 1266, Mongolian was probably exclusively for diplomacy with other Mongol Khanites and among the royal family. The few surviving works of Golden Horde poetry that come from the 14th century are all in Turkic, such as Kup's poem dedicated to Tinibey Han. This video, as a history of Nogai's early life, is mostly speculative, but based on details we know of the Jochid and Mongol elite at large. A man trained to be a warrior and nomad, but used to being treated as a social superior. Devoted to Berka Han, a Muslim, bilingual in Turkic and Mongolian, and, likely, an alcoholic. These are a few of the traits that affected him for the rest of his life. Our next video gets more concrete though, looking at the Great War between Berka and Hulagu over the Caucasus, where Nogai makes his first splash in the historical sources. You won't want to miss it, so subscribe or whatever. Sometimes I put videos up. Kolay gelsin.